Hello, everyone. All right, so thanks everyone for being here today. Welcome to the CDDRL seminar series. Thank you to the people on Zoom. Hello, Larry. So we are delighted to have with us Yascha Mounk, who is a professor of the practice of international affairs at Johns Hopkins University. He's a contributing editor to The Atlantic, a senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations, a founder of Persuasion, and a host of a podcast called The Good Fight. And most recently, his book is The Great Experiment. You don't have a copy of it?
I don't actually know. I should, I suppose. I should hold it in the camera.
Yeah, exactly. Well, you can find it online. And that's what he will be discussing today. If you have any questions on Zoom, please go ahead and enter them into the box and we will get to them during Q&A. All right, Yascha.
Wonderful. Well, thank you. Didi and I went grad school together, so it's lovely to see a familiar face, as well as a number of other familiar faces around the room. So I went back and forth a little bit in preparing for today, thinking about whether I wanted to zoom in on some of the particular parts of the argument in a way that may feel a little bit more academic, or whether to give you an overview of the overall project. And I decided that the most interesting thing would actually be to give you a sense of how the different pieces fit together, and then we can sort of, I hate this term, double click on any particular part of this in the Q&A. It's not nice, right? Great. So why the great experiment? This goes back to something that happened to me about 4 years ago when I was promoting the last book, The People versus Democracy, which was about the rise of populism, the threat it poses to liberal democracy. And I was on a big news show in Germany. And I was asked about the reasons for the rise of populism. I said that it's due to stagnation of living standards for ordinary citizens, the rise of the internet and of social media. And with the third factor, the way in which a lot of democracies that used to be homogeneous, or a lot of democracies that used to really give very significant formal privileges to one group over other groups, are becoming increasingly ethnically and religiously diverse. And the fact that creates real challenges and real problems, but it's a unique experiment for which there's no precedent, but that we can make it work. And so I got done with the interview, and my mom, who watches all my German interviews and always hates them, rang me to say that it went great. And I went to sleep and boarded a plane to the United States, and switched my phone on 12 hours later, and I just had hate mail from hundreds of people saying, how dare you experiment on the German people? And it turns out that these sort of far-right newspapers and blogs and so on had seized on this phrase, the great experiment, to suggest that I and Angela Merkel were plotting to replace the German population with a more pliable set of people or something like that. And so I reflected on that phrase, which I had used somewhat spontaneously in that context, but I thought that it actually does describe very well what is happening now, but of course in a different way to how it had been interpreted. So one meaning of experiment is sort of a chemistry teacher who comes into 9th grade and sort of, lets one liquid flow into the other, and there's a big explosion, and he knows exactly what's going to happen and then uses that as an illustration of some chemical process. The other sense of experiment is one that we're familiar with thinking about American history from the framers of a constitution. It is to say that you're in an unprecedented political situation that you find yourself in without having a plan to get into it, but that you have to make a new set of ideas and institutions work because the alternatives are far worse. And I think that is what does describe the predicament not only of the United States at the moment, but of many other democracies around the world. Many democracies in the United States, in Britain and Germany and Brazil and other places are deeply ethnically and religiously diverse now. Many of those democracies were founded at a moment when they were comparatively homogeneous, where the depth of the ethnic and religious diversity of which they had to deal was much lower than it is now. And others have always been diverse since their founding, like the United States, that quote unquote dealt with that problem by relegating a lot of population groups to an inferior status, by excluding and in some cases subjugating them in extreme ways. And so what we're trying to do now is to build these deeply ethnically and religiously diverse democracies but actually treat the members as equals, and there is no precedent for that. So I want to talk about three things briefly that I develop in much greater detail in the book. The first is an explanation for why this is actually a very hard thing to do, why we need to take the challenge of building diverse democracies very seriously in order to be able to confront this challenge. The second is to talk about the reasons why we should actually be optimistic about the current state of our societies despite those challenges. And the third is to just say a few words about the vision of the kind of society it takes for us to keep our societies from falling apart and to actually convince the majority of our fellow citizens that this experiment is worth seeing through, that it is worth trying to make this work. So the difficulty of building diverse democracy has roots in psychology, in history, and in a way in democratic theory. So let me touch very briefly on these 3 points. Psychologically, I grew up with a kind of hope of overcoming groups. I grew up with a kind of hope that we might all start to identify as individuals or perhaps as cosmopolitans, laying more store by our own individual attributes and by our duties towards all people in the world than by what seemed to me pretty arbitrary national or subnational groups. But both the politics of the last few decades and the power that groups, including nations, evidently still have within it, and my reading in social psychology has convinced me that this is naive. Even a lot of people who think of themselves as not really being groupish can very easily form groups and then favor their members over outsiders. I'm sure that this is familiar to all of you, but I do the nice little exercise with my students who, Hopkins is an extremely diverse campus, and my students think of themselves as some of the most tolerant people in the world, and in some ways they are. But if you ask them whether a hot dog is a sandwich and have them debate that question for a few minutes, then the people who think that a hot dog is a sandwich start to discriminate against the people who think that a hot dog is not a sandwich in a simple game that can have them play afterwards, right? So we need to reckon as one of just the fundamental human attributes that shape our societies with the ease of forming groups and the ease in which that triggers this in-group favoritism, out-group discrimination mechanism. It's an obvious point. The second obvious point is that in human history, that mechanism has often led to some of the worst crimes that we as a species have committed. That not all of the worst instances of violence and subjugation are structured along the lines of religion, ethnicity, race, culture, nationality, but a lot of them. And so we know the ways in which diverse societies have often fallen apart into wars, civil wars, forms of genocide, forms of ethnic cleansing along those lines. And I have an argument in the book about sort of 3 predominant modes of failure of diverse societies in the past, which are called structured anarchy, domination, and fragmentation. We can talk a little bit more about that in the Q&A. But the third point, which I think is interesting, is that obviously as somebody who cares a lot about democracy, I was tempted to say, perhaps democratic institutions are the solution to this problem. And in certain ways, I do think that democratic institutions rightly designed in alignment with the basic values of philosophical liberalism and individual rights and so on, can be part of the solution. That is the argument of the book. But there is also one very important way, which should be familiar from the work of Horowitz and others, in which democracies can exacerbate intergroup conflict. The most obvious way in which this is the case is that in a monarchy or in an empire, you sort of have to rely on the monarch, but as long as you do, the relative size of groups becomes less important. A democracy is always a search for majorities. And so if you feel like you are part of a majority group and a minority group is growing more rapidly than your own group because of immigration or other kinds of things, then this triggers the fear that, hang on a second, that group might suddenly take over power and they might suddenly outwork me. And that is really dangerous, but it's going to take away some of the rights and privileges to which I'm accustomed. We're obviously seeing in our politics in many countries the potential that gives for the far right to exploit that fear of demographic change. And so if you take those 3 points together, the human instinct to form groups, the way in which diverse societies have so often fallen apart along those lines, and the way in which democratic institutions are not well designed and managed can exacerbate those tensions, you see that the challenge we're confronting is a very serious one. So far, the pessimism. Now, ironically, the more I thought about this topic and the more I thought about public opinion on this topic, the more I noticed a seemingly paradoxical phenomenon, where in the public debate, those difficulties I've talked about are often ignored. People say, look, how difficult can it be to sustain a diverse democracy? How difficult can it be not to hate your neighbor? How difficult can it be not to be a bigot? And that's a natural set of thoughts, but it actually then very easily leads to a very profound pessimism or even a fatalism. Because if you think this should be easy, and then you look at the state of our society and the very real injustices and the very real discrimination that it contains, it becomes very tempting to say, well, what on earth is wrong with us? Right? Perhaps there's something uniquely bad about our societies, uniquely bad about our political values or institutions, and perhaps we really don't deserve to have any hope for building a better future. I'm trying to build the case in this book, in The Great Experiment, not for a fatalism rooted in naivety, as I see a lot of the discourse, but in an optimism, and a hard-won optimism that is rooted in a realistic appreciation of the difficulties we face. Now, I want to distinguish between two different things we might be optimistic about. One thing we might be optimistic about is the state of our political systems, the state of our democracies, is the extent to which our institutions are not threatened. And I'm not optimistic about any of those things, right? In keeping with my earlier work and in keeping with the headlines, when you look at the newspapers, it is very obvious that authoritarian populists continue to pose a very serious threat to the stability of liberal democracies like the United States, and that is going to continue to be the case for a significant number of years. What I am more optimistic about than a lot of recent scholarship and than a lot of recent public discussion is the extent to which our societies are managing to contain tensions between different ethnic and religious groups, and the extent to which we have made progress on treating people as real equals in our society. And so just a few points on that. One is that conceptions of who truly belongs and who deserves to be an equal in our society have really changed very rapidly among the majority population of many democracies around the world. So one of the things I'm struck by in the World Value Surveys and other opinion polls is the extent to which the sense of who is a true European, a true German or Italian or Swede, have really transformed in the last decades. Even as I was growing up in Germany, there was still a very strong sense that a true quote-unquote German is one who has grandparents or great-grandparents who already lived in Germany, one who has a story of shared ethnic descent. That is now a minority opinion. A majority of people in these societies recognize that the right criterion of membership should be much more inclusive than that. And that is a really fundamental change of public opinion in terms of who belongs. In the same way, there has been a very important transformation in public opinion in the United States, which is often sort of hard to recall because in some ways of how much it shaped our new reality on some fundamental aspects of race relations. So I'm struck by the fact that as late as about 1990, a majority of Americans still believed that interracial marriage was immoral. It was immoral for a white and a black American to marry each other. That figure is now down to the single digits. And that's good evidence that this is not just a response bias in polls, because we see real sociological changes in behavior. Most obviously the fact that about 1 in 33 American newborns used to be mixed race, now it's up to about 1 in 7. I think you can make a similar case for optimism when you look at immigration and the way in which immigrants are both integrating and advancing socioeconomically. So on the far right, you often have the argument, either stated explicitly or implied, that there's something wrong with the immigrants that are coming today to the United States, for example, from El Salvador and Vietnam and Kenya, and that they're not succeeding at integrating, perhaps not wanting to integrate in the way that Italian and Irish immigrants did 100 years ago. The mainstream and the left of discourse rightly rejects that as preposterous. But I find both in the scholarship, in parts of the scholarship, especially non-empirical scholarship, and in what you might find from looking at the New York Times and so on, a strange echo of that pessimism, where the argument is that because of discrimination and because of the racism in our society, but it's undoubtedly real, immigrants today just cannot succeed in the way that they did 100 years ago, which non-white immigrants today from these various countries will never get the chance of succeeding and integrating in the way that white immigrants did 100 years ago. But this actually is contradicted by the best empirical work on these questions. So we're seeing in Europe, for example, that the children and the grandchildren of immigrants to countries like Germany and France and the United Kingdom are rising in the socioeconomic ranks and experiencing educational mobility at much faster rates than the children and the grandchildren of similarly situated non-immigrant ancestors. And in the United States, the best study seems to suggest that the speed of integration and of economic advancement of immigrants to the United States today, despite the discrimination and the racism that they face, is actually about the same as the speed of integration was for Italian and Irish immigrants 100 years ago. So I think that's another important point on which it is helpful to take seriously some of the social progress that we've been making in the last decades, and to be a little bit more hopeful about the state of our society, not at the political level, but in the heart of society, than many people are. I could go on a lot longer about some of the grounds for empirical optimism, but hopefully that gives at least a little bit of a taste of that set of arguments. So the question then becomes, what kind of society should we seek to build? What is the vision, the model of a diverse democracy that can sustain support from its citizens and hopefully even make us excited for the kinds of countries and democracies that we want to build? So let me end by just explaining some of the core parts of the argument about that. I start with a defense of the basis for a philosophically liberal account of the right relationship between individuals, groups, and the state. I think that we need to grant people what I call a double liberty. Now, the first of those liberties is very obvious and intuitive, and it is made over more urgent by the violent history of the 20th century and the things that often went wrong within it. It is the right of individuals and of people who belong to unpopular political, cultural, or religious minorities to be true to themselves and to be true to their identities without having to fear the oppression of the state or a mob formed by the majority. So that is the case for protections that individuals need to enjoy against the state. But there's also a second liberty, which I think is also important, and here my thinking is influenced by Diana Simoglu and James Robinson's description of the narrow corridor of what they call the cage of norms. So the second kind of very serious threat to people being able to live a self-determined life throughout history has been the ways in which their own communities, their own parents, their own neighbors, their own priests and imams and rabbis have historically imposed on them a set of very detailed norms of how they have to live, and often punished them in extreme ways when they deviated from it. And so the second task that contemporary diverse democracy has to fulfill is to keep the state enough at bay to ensure it doesn't become tyrannical, but also to have the state ensure that the groups within society don't in turn oppress their members and tell them exactly how they have to live. This then forms the basis for a critique of communitarianism, which is not capable of explaining why this is a legitimate task of the state. If you conceive of society as a group of groups or as an association of associations, as the political theorist Lord Parrott puts it, you cannot have the right normative justification for why the state should intervene when, say, evangelical parents send their 15-year-old kid who happens to be gay to conversion camp or something, to conversion therapy or something like that. But it does also require the defense of a form of liberalism that is political rather than perfectionist, and that perhaps does better than some strands of liberal political thinking have historically been at expressing the dignity and the significance of groups. So what I mean by that is that the reasons for the core individual rights, like freedom of worship and freedom of association, should not be seen as a skepticism of or hostility to groups. It is the recognition that to many of us, our membership in particular groups is a fundamental and important fact about us, that many of us don't freely choose ab nihilo what kind of group to be a member of. But the limiting principle is that these groups deserve our respect, not as groups, not as constitutive elements of our society, but derivatively of a freely chosen membership of those who invest significance in them. So even if people don't choose the groups freely at 18, even if most people continue to be members of the groups that their parents raised them in, they have to have the freedom to leave them. And it is that which makes groups in our societies have dignity and value rather than making them oppressive. The next thing I turn to is to think about the kind of metaphor that can help to guide us in how to think about the goals of a diverse society and an immigrant society. And I criticize the two traditional conceptions of how that has often been talked about. I criticize the melting pot, which if you read the original play by Israel Zangbaal, actually can have some real moral appeal. It's a really fascinating play, but we can talk about it afterwards, but which has historically often been invoked in such a way as to say that to be truly integrated, to truly succeed in the way in which we're asking people to be members of society, they have to give up far too much of their original particularity, right? They have to become indistinguishable from each other in a way that creates, I think, a too impoverished a vision of the kind of societies we want to live in. Now, the counter model, which has become very popular in academic circles, is, I think, equally concerning. That is the idea of a salad bowl, or in some formulations of mosaic, because I think it underestimates how much connective tissue we need to keep our society stable and to ensure that citizens that belong to different ethnic and religious groups continue to be able to have forms of meaningful solidarity with each other, that will continue to be able to sustain welfare states and other kinds of public goods, that they don't end up falling foul to the ever-present danger of fragmentation in which diverse societies have so often found it. And so what I suggest is a third kind of metaphor, which is that of the public park. And the reason why I think the public park is helpful is, for one, it's not a culinary metaphor. I'm so sick of this culinary metaphor. So that is kind of platform, right? It is something where people don't have to be united in a purpose, and there can be difference between the behavior that they have in that context. So what this means is that all of us after this talk can go to a public park together and say, we want to stay among ourselves and continue this conversation. We don't want to engage with anybody else. And that's our good right. Nothing wrong with that. But we might also go and meet people from another department or meet people from a completely different walk of life and create new connections with them. Both of those things are liberties that we should have in a free society, but we can also step outside of a situation and judge it from the outside and say, perfectly fine for each individual person to make the choice just to stay among their own group. But if everybody in a society starts to do that, we start to have a problem, because then we're going to lack the mutual solidarity and the connective tissue we need to sustain those institutions. So there's free choice among individuals as to the extent to which to stay within the groups and go outside of the groups. Perfectly fine for many people to make the choice to stay within the group. But when we fall below a certain kind of threshold of mutual connection, of exchange, of intermingling of groups and cultures, then we can expect to have real problems in terms of the stability and the success of these diverse societies. And the public park can help to express that as a metaphor. Third, I advocate for the fact that my original idea when I was 20 of just having individuals was naive. We're always going to have these very strong groups. And in fact, the thing that will come most naturally to people in many diverse societies is to invest their religious, cultural, and to some extent ethnic groups with deep importance. But that is all the more reason why we also need to cultivate a level of national belonging, which helps to give people who otherwise belong to these different groups a level of identity that they share. And I think we're seeing at the moment in Ukraine that patriotism, while certainly in many circumstances dangerous, can also provide the kind of kit which is inspiring millions of people to voluntarily risk their lives to defend the country against this terrible Russian invasion. So I think of patriotism as a half-domesticated animal, which can be stoked and provoked by the worst kinds of people to run wild and do a lot of damage, but which can also become very useful if we tame it in the right kind of way. And that, of course, raises the question of what an inclusive and tamed patriotism might look like. I reject, for reasons that are kind of obvious and boring, ethnic nationalism. So I'm not going to spend too much time on that. Don't think there's many people who strongly support an ethnic conception of nationalism for diverse democracies in this room. I support civic patriotism and constitutional patriotism as an important element of what a healthy form of national sentiment might look like. I myself was proud to become a United States citizen 5 years ago and to swear in the spring of 2017 to defend the Constitution and the laws of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. So this is something that's meaningful to me. But I'm more skeptical than many of my friends and colleagues that civic and constitutional patriotism can either be a sufficient kit for diverse democracies, or that it can adequately describe the nature of the national attachment that most people actually feel. And so I have two objections here. One is philosophical, and one is very straightforward and empirical. The philosophical objection is that patriotism is always a particular affinity, right? It's an affinity to a very specific country. It is compatible with respect for all other countries, but it is a love that is supererogatory of something very specific. But the kinds of liberal democratic values we're talking about are thankfully now the province of much more than one country, are shared among many different countries. And so I think that civic patriotism has difficulty explaining why, for example, a German Verfassungspatriot should feel a special affiliation for Germany rather than for France or Austria. And in fact, even if Austria or Australia adopted tomorrow a word-for-word facsimile of the United States Constitution, those of us in this room who are American would not become Austrian or Australian patriots. That's just not how it works. So I think there's actually a conceptual problem with the way that people think about constitutional patriotism. The second problem is empirical, which is that most people simply don't care that much about politics. And when they say that they love a country, they just don't tend to think about however beautiful a text written on parchment. And so what I defend is a second conception of patriotism, which we should add to the civic patriotism, and that's an everyday cultural patriotism. I think when most people say that they love the United States, they love Germany, they love their country, what they mean is that they love its cities and landscapes, its sights and sounds and smells, its cultural scripts, the ways that in this room we deal with each other, even silly things like its celebrities or its TikTok stars. Now that sense of love for your country is compatible with recognizing and fighting against the injustices within it. It is rooted in a dynamic and ever-changing culture rather than something that just harkens back to some kind of imagined past. And I think it bears in most societies today the hallmark of an ethnic and religious diversity, which actually characterizes those countries. But it is something that's very strong and that we should recognize and to some extent encourage as one of the bases of national solidarity that can help us see that we have things in common beyond those subnational groups. I'm going to say one thing, just saving the most provocative thing for the last, and I know I'm about exceeding the time that I was hoping to speak, so I'll keep it brief. I think one important part of the vision of the kind of society you should want to create is to reject in a fundamental way both theories of a rising demographic majority for some political party like Democrats in the United States, and more broadly the assumption, which is very widely shared now, that a country like the United States will become majority minority within a relatively brief span of time. So let me very briefly explain what I mean by those 2 points. As most of you will know, there is this idea that because white voters today tend to favor the Republican Party and non-white voters tend to favor the Democratic Party, and because the share of the non-white population is growing in such a way that supposedly by 2045 or 2042 or 2048 it's going to be a majority of the population, sort of political fortunes for both Democrats and Republicans will change. Democrats are going to find it easier and easier to win elections, and Republicans will find it harder and harder to win elections. This idea, I think, drives a lot of damaging behavior in our politics. It is what inspires a lot of the right and the far right to engage in voter suppression, to cast the lot in with ever more extreme candidates. The infamous text by Michael Anton, a later senior advisor at the Trump White House in 2016 flight 93 election, is a prime example of that, where he talks about, quote unquote, the ceaseless importation of third world foreigners, unquote, and the way in which that supposedly destroys the future of the Republican Party and the American Republic. It also, I think, drives a lot of sort of triumphalism and ill-advised electoral strategy among Democrats. It is erroneous as a electoral theory. If you had looked at the voting behavior of Irish Americans in the 1960s, you would have said they're the key voting bloc or a key voting bloc for the Democratic Party. Today, they're a key voting bloc for the Republican Party. If you look at the 2020 elections, you see that the main reason why Donald Trump was competitive in it is that he significantly improved his share of the vote among every non-white demographic, including African Americans and Asian Americans, and especially Latino. And the main reasons why Joe Biden is the legitimately elected 46th president of the United States is that he significantly increased the share of the vote among white voters relative to Hillary Clinton. So predictions of what our politics will look like in 20 years based simply on those demographic trends are very, very flawed. Importantly, they're also dystopian. What is sometimes treated by some of my colleagues as a hopeful vision of the future, I think is actually a very ugly vision. I don't want to live in a country in which I can walk around campus or look around this room and know who you're going to vote for by observing the color of your skin. And in fact, it would probably require a lot of people in this room to vote for a different political party from what they envisage voting for in a few decades or today. But I go even a step further, because I think that we have become too complacent in accepting the one-drop rule, which is obvious savings for African Americans for the obvious and terrible historical reasons, as an accurate sociological description of our society, even as it pertains to other demographic groups, and as a society might look like in 20 or 30 years. So I actually think that when you observe the way in which mixed race Americans identify according to sociological studies, if you observe the complicated way in which Asian Americans fit into the overall demographic constellation in the United States in terms of both their political preferences on certain issues and the very different socioeconomic standing compared to African Americans, for example. If you observe that according to many studies, Latinos often think of themselves as white rather than as people of color, and certainly think of themselves very strongly as whites within the political context from which they come in Central and Latin America. And even if you observe the emerging splits between descendants of slaves on the one side and the descendants of more recent immigrants from African nations on the other side, I just think that it is in obvious ways overly simplistic to split America up into these two blocks of whites and people of color. And so rather than continuing to echo and to embrace this racialism in an unquestioning way, we should try and resist the description whenever we can. In very specific and precise context, it may have a usefulness, but I think the way we talk about this far exerts what a fair description of our current visions would be and what the kind of vision for the society we should build would look like. So summing up, what we're trying to do in building these deeply ethnically and religiously diverse democracies is very, very hard. There's a very real risk of failure, and we know from history what the failure would entail. But I do think that we can also be proud of some of the progress we have made over the last decades, and on the basis of some of the fundamental principles of liberal democracy, try to build on that process further, on the progress further in the coming decades.
All right, thanks so much, Yascha. If you have a question, please raise your hand, and I'll start. So this theory of yours, so on the sort of narrow corridor, like norms argument, how will you know when there's a threshold of fragmentation versus not? And I'm just thinking about the cultural change around ideas of inclusion and belonging. Like there, just in the past 5 years alone, has been such a different conversation about what it means to feel safe in a space or to belong in a place where your group is not typically represented. I think about like conversations about seminar rooms when we were in graduate school, how they might have been hostile to some groups and not others. And we talk about that now, and we didn't then. So when do you know when groups are being adequately respectful of one another? And when do you know when oppression is happening?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, I think that's also part of democratic debate, right? I don't think that there is sort of an objective criterion that I can come up with and say, no, in this situation, the world is perfectly fair, in this situation, it's not. A lot of this is the give and take of democratic discussion where individuals make claims about the way in which they feel that a situation is unjust. And then we debate whether those claims are rooted in reality, whether or not they represent a group, and we speak for the group that they claim to speak to, which may or may not be true. And more broadly, I think our obligation as citizens is to listen to each other very carefully when people make those kind of remarks, right? So one of the subpoints I touch on in the book is what should our model of political solidarity be? And I think that there are two ways of thinking about this which are really worrying. One is to say, well, you don't really need to listen to each other, right? Like I can think about the world for myself, and if you're saying, hey, I don't feel respected in the seminar room, I don't need to listen to you because I see everything through my own eyes. And that's obviously naive about the ways in which a room might, or a situation might read very differently to somebody who is marginalized within it and to somebody who's not. On the other hand, I think there's a growing movement to say the way this discussion should work is that members of more privileged groups should defer to the judgment of members of less privileged groups. And I have a few concerns about that. One of them is that claims by people to speak for a group need also to be assessed, because often they're not in fact speaking for that group in any meaningful way. And we're seeing that very clearly in the disjunct between Latino political activism and the views and voting behaviors of Latino voters, for example. But also, I think it's just an ineffective ask, right? The vast majority of people will not defer in that kind of way. It's not a realistic theory of psychological motivation. And the people who do are still going to pick the representatives of the group and say, well, I'm deferring, but I'm deferring to this person who I think is a real representative because the views already agree with views that I have. And so I think a better model of political solidarity more broadly in society is to start with the recognition that there are probably many forms of injustice that are invisible to each of us because of the place where we sit ourselves, and that when our fellow citizens make a claim about injustice or make a claim for some form of redress, we should be very humble and listen to it very carefully. But that the worst forms of injustice are communicable. Even if we might not entirely understand what it feels like to experience it, we can absolutely understand enough about it to realize why it violates some fundamental principles that we might hold. And so we should actually aim for a more substantive form of political solidarity, which is rooted in our own conceptions, sometimes shared, sometimes slightly divergent, of what the kind of society we want to live in looks like. And then we can say, hey, I'm not deferring to your claim. I want to be part of a university community in which everybody feels included in the seminar room. And so I don't know exactly what it feels like to you. My listening to you has made it clear to me that there are some problems with the norms we have. And so let's try to reform those norms.
Okay. So, Catherine?
So really interesting and provocative, of course. So I'm curious as to why you focus on ethnicity only in terms of identity, or ethnicity and religion, because especially in the United States, and I speak as a Canadian and an American, I did the same thing as you and took that oath. There are so many cleavages, and at any one moment we each have a different identity, right? So you're emphasizing my whiteness, for example, but I'm also a woman, right? And so just in the context of the leaked draft Roe v. Wade, it seems as though the divisions are more than just Black, white, Latino, for example, but also there's in religion, right? There's a kind of a gender assault as well, and a fundamentally different set of values about who should have what rights. So do you, in this argument, how do you handle that? Because I'm not very optimistic about a democracy handling these differences. We had a process, judges were asked, and they either perjured themselves in front of the Senate in terms of this being settled law, or the institution didn't seem to work in this case, and we're now risking cementing, this kind of discrimination.
Yeah, so I do talk a lot about religion as well in the book, perhaps a little bit less in this presentation. So I think of this book about really how to deal with problems of ethnic and religious and cultural diversity. And you are right that they bracket out other forms of diversity like class and like gender.
You're right.
And the reason for that lies in the nature of what I call the great experiment, which is to say that obviously our society has always had different genders within it. And it's also obviously also had different classes within it. And so I think a lot of what drives the nuttiness of our politics right now is the fears which those new forms of diversity are inspiring in many parts of the political spectrum. And so what I want to offer is a set of solutions about how to deal with that new part of the problem as it were. That doesn't mean that the others are not very important, and it doesn't certainly mean that they don't inspire real cleavages within our society. For the same reason, I don't talk that much about ideological cleavages. Probably actually the thing I'm most worried about in the United States today is the very extreme partisan cleavage we have and the way it's tearing our country apart. So I recognize that there's certainly forms of cleavage and to some extent forms of diversity that I don't talk about in the book. But the book's already about a lot of things, and the way I try to constrain it is to distinguish between what is really new in this situation and which questions, like questions about abortion, have been with us for a very long time. We can perhaps discuss over lunch my somewhat smaller pessimism about, well, I'm not even sure I would put it this way. I think comparative politics is our friend when we think about the headlines from yesterday. But we'll talk about it over lunch. It's a different topic.
Eric, and then I have I2 Johannes, and if anybody else has one.
So thank you for this talk. It's very interesting. Back in the 1980s, the bicentennial year of the Constitution, Time magazine said, the Constitution is our secular religion. A colleague of mine at the law school said that. That is certainly no longer true today. The Constitution is read on the floor of Congress for purely partisan purposes, as is green eggs and ham. But I want to push a bit on operationalizing a sense of national identity in a very concrete way. Since the mandatory draft, the compulsory draft was discontinued in our country, we do not have a national service of comparable scope where you mix classes, ethnicity, race, everything else. And I think it's really been harmful to and contributed to our fragmentation and balkanization of national identity. So I've got a couple of students looking at different programs of national service, and Europe still has these programs. We don't, and I think we desperately need one. And many of us have been recommending national service for years, and I'm looking forward to my students' output on this comparative study of national service. But I just wonder, you've got your public park. I appreciate you moving away from the culinary analogy. How do we build a national identity with a concrete program that includes this public park?
Great question. I think there's a few things we can do at different levels of society. I'm also a proponent of a system of national service, and it should probably be voluntary for various reasons, and that will limit its effectiveness, but I think it would be a very positive contribution. I think there's all kinds of social actors and institutions that can do a lot better than that. This is not a huge thing, but I think it's an important development because it's telling. A lot of universities, I don't know about Stanford, have moved away from assigning students randomly to dorms. And so they are allowing students to pick who they want to room with in the first year. In a way, I get this because it's always struck me that, Stanford's such a luxurious place, and so many American universities are so luxurious compared to European universities. And yet you stick these poor 18-year-olds into one room and they have live in the same physical room with each other for a year. Like Europeans don't do that. Imagine Europe is a lot less luxurious in many ways. So I get that it's more comforting to be in a room with somebody who perhaps you know from high school, or who went through your town, or you met at some kind of meetup before you came to college. But I think that was a really important mechanism, at least for America's elites, to get to know people who are a little bit different from them and to force them to spend time together. And I think it's a dangerous sign of the times that so many universities are moving towards that. Because obviously when you allow people to put in a request for who they want to live with, they're going to live with people who are much more likely to be ethnically, socioeconomically, and geographically similar, right? But more broadly, my argument is certainly not an argument for the state to do very much about cultural patriotism, right? it is an argument, it is more than anything else, an empirical description and a call for us to recognize the empirical reality of the country. And there, as an immigrant to this country, I have to say that Americans, in my experience, always underestimate the degree of the common cultural kit they have. I don't think it's enough for them to recognize the assault on the Capitol as a problem, or it's not enough for them to sort of overcome political divisions. But actually, I think for anybody who didn't grow up in the United States, it's more salient than for too many people who did grow up here, how much Americans of different geographic reasons, of different political persuasions, and of different ethnicities certainly do share by way of how they speak to each other, how they deal with each other, what sort of influences their frame of reference. Just to tell one story, I'm thinking of a student of mine, a very impressive student, who I believe is undocumented, and certainly her parents are undocumented. And he said, look, I'm not a citizen. I don't recognize myself in this kind of cultural belonging. And I respect that, and that has very obvious and unjust reasons. But I was also, as I shared with her, very struck by the extremely American way in which she shared her objection with me. Right? There's a particular way in which a student at an American university gives you, friendly pushback as a professor. That's very different from France, and very different from England, and very different from Germany. And culturally, despite whatever her passport may say, and despite the misgivings that she and her family may have about the country, she's 100% American. And so I just think that as a description of the continuing ability of countries to integrate their citizens, especially when they grow up in the country, everyday cultural patriotism is more salient than it might appear. I thought earlier, in response to your question to a slightly in terms of what I thought in the first sentence, to share a story about language, right? We say, what does integration mean? Well, there's people on the right who really worry about the extent to which people integrate linguistically. And there's some people on the left who say they shouldn't integrate linguistically. Perfectly fine if people are just going to speak Spanish or Chinese or whatever, not really learn English, and that's okay. The sociological reality is that English wins a resounding victory, right? But in the first generation, when people come here, if they're adults and if they perhaps come from countries with less educational opportunity, they might never learn English very well. But their children nearly always prefer to speak English among their siblings, among cousins, among other people with a similar background of migration. And the grandchildren, only 1% even still speak the language of origin to any significant extent. So, which is melancholy, right? It would be nice if we continue to speak those languages too. But just as a sociological reality, I think the force of integration and the force of an overlapping series of cultures within the country is stronger than we sometimes get to have.
My question actually builds on that, because like this cultural integration that you're talking about doesn't always lead to cultural patriotism, right? So this student you talked about doesn't necessarily become an American or cultural patriot, and doesn't always contribute to the survival of the American democracy in the way you want her or him to contribute. And also the idea of cultural patriotism, it is like liking the smells or liking like the landscape of your country. It's also very nostalgic. And when this diversity is happening, this cultural patriotism actually makes you not like the change rather than liking the change. Like in Turkey, for instance, right now, there's a huge group of Syrian refugees, and the change it creates in our cities is very much disliked by the people who would consider themselves as cultural patriots, not even nationalists. Like the signs turning into Arabic, everywhere is becoming a Syrian restaurant. Like they hate this on Twitter right now. So I don't very much understand how cultural patriotism is going to contribute to the idea of surviving, making democracy survive in diverse societies. So.
Yeah, I think in a way the question about cultural patriotism is a sub-question of a broader question about patriotism and nationalism, right? There's always the danger. That's this metaphor for me of a half-domesticated animal. There's always the danger that any form of patriotism is going to be monopolized by people for the purpose of exclusion. And so one answer to it, which is a natural answer, which comes naturally to me as somebody who grew up as a Jew in Germany, in which I held for many years of my life, including the first years of my adult life. So let's get as far as possible away from nationalism, because it always has the danger of being instrumentalized in these terrible ways. It's, by the way, this is a side note, it's why I tend to dislike the distinction between patriotism and nationalism, because I think a lot of political theorists sort of want to put all the good things on patriotism and all the terrible things on nationalism. And in certain contexts, a kind of conceptual distinction that's helpful. But empirically, it sometimes can blind us to the fact that the good sides of patriotism and the bad sides of nationalism are two sides of the same coin, right? I think making the distinction too readily makes us think we can encourage patriotism and never have to worry about nationalism, but the one can turn into the other in ways that we should always remain aware of, which is why I think it's sometimes an overly neat distinction, right? But I'm also convinced that when you make the decision to flee the terrain of patriotism, well, that's where you get people like Erdogan and people like Trump and people like Modi really exploiting the very rich set of symbols and associations it has for their own kinds of purposes. So I would rather take the fight to them on that terrain. And so I think the question of cultural patriotism is similar. Absolutely, there can be a form of cultural patriotism where Modi in India, for example, is saying, when people now are celebrating Halloween and going to Halloween parties, that's anti-Indian and anti-Hindu, and it's a terrible aberration of our culture. I think the right response to that is say, no, we're living, breathing culture. And change is part of that. And that's actually what many people love about their country. And certainly in most democracies today, look, immigration always comes with its challenges, and there's always people who reject it. But I think most people in the United States today do recognize the contributions that immigrants make culturally, do recognize the joys also of the diversity we have within the country. And that's an argument that you can win. Now, you have to win the argument, and there's always a danger you will lose it. And there's always a danger that somebody tries to impose a kind of a nostalgic idea of what it is to be a true American, which will then exclude people. You have to take it very seriously. But I think rather than saying, well, no, culture has nothing to do with patriotism and it's dangerous and let's get rid of it, I think we should say, yes, one of the things that does make me love America is the things that are great about it and the things that culturally mark the country in ways in which it's different from many other countries. But what culture is in 2022 is also, I mean, it's easy to fall into cliches, but it's also Chinatown, right? It's also Koreatown, it's also Old Town Road, and the way in which it fuses everything from R&B to country and so on into a new kind of form. And I think that has real powerful cachet. Now, the second aspect of the question is, how politically useful is that? I don't think it's politically useful in the sense that you can mobilize it that easily against January 6th or something like that. And there's real limits on it. But I do think that it is useful in terms of giving people a willingness and a desire to stay together. It is why the fears that people have about Texas will secede and Massachusetts will secede and so on, I think ultimately are just not very well founded, because at some bottom level, most Americans do feel that they have a set of national commonalities. And that's not necessarily true in Belgium, and in a different kind of way, it's not necessarily true in Lebanon. So I think we should appreciate that cultural kit is something that's actually very important in shaping outcomes and in being a prerequisite for the kind of society we want to build.
Well, I think, thank you very much, I think, for this very interesting concept. I mean, it's all come from Germany. So my experience in politics and also my personal life is the best thing to overcome these problems which I have described is simply to meet one another. And where do you meet? People from totally different groups. Where do you do that? And what I see in my own life is I met them during my military service. 1.5 years, you are meeting people. You have to live together with them. And that is my experience. You start appreciating people you otherwise would never have met. The backbone of our military unit was not the future academic people, those graduated from school, from gymnasium, as we say it now. No, the backbone was the people, when it really became difficult in Syria, the backbone were the people with a professional, I think, training. What we have in Germany is apprenticeship, people who have graduated from this and were on the way to become what we call master. That's, by the way, interesting. In Germany, the title master which in the US is an academic fund. In Germany, it is not, it's an academic, but it is also, I think, a title for people who have made a professional training career. So they are parallel. And that is where it is. And those people you are going to meet. And then you have respect. Since this experience, I have a lot of respect for the, I'm absolutely aware from this personal experience that what Germany can really accomplish is not because we have wonderful universities only and academics, you know. No, we have something besides this, you know, which normal academic people don't meet in their life. And that is, I think, what is important, that you meet people, that you have a personal experience. And therefore, I think one of the great mistakes Angela Merkel made was to discontinue the obligatory military service, not for military purposes, that is the secondary question. No, but for keeping the society together, to bring people together, to give them a personal experience, you know, of other groups they otherwise never meet. And therefore, I think this is what I would do. Also, we are discussing that in Germany from time to time, introducing this obligatory, not military, that may be, but also a social service.
And that's your national service idea.
Right. But by the way, I discussed with somebody in Washington recently. He had a good idea. He said, well, before introducing that in an obligatory way, why not, I think, giving as an incentive that those who are participating in this, you know, that they get the tuition fees for college paid by the government.
Or debt forgiveness.
On military service, I'm torn, and on military civil service, I'm torn because I do think it's also a great imposition on individual freedom. And so, you know, if you don't have
the Cold War, when the Russians were 100 kilometers away.
No, sure.
We have a lot of questions, so let's let Yascha finish.
Anyway, the point being, I agree with you with a positive impact of having some form of forced togetherness like that. I think it shouldn't be compulsory for those reasons, but I agree with you with the importance of that. Let me make a couple of observations. One is, you know, I've been reflecting a little bit about my experience in the United States. We started Credit Code 15 years ago?
No, probably
10 years ago, 5 years ago. And I was thinking about who do I know in this country and who don't I know. You know, along with the dimensions that my book is about, my group of friends, acquaintances, and colleagues is reasonably diverse. It's not as diverse as it might be, but it's really pretty diverse. It's certainly much more diverse than the set of people I grew up with in Germany. Socioeconomically, it is extremely and shockingly homogeneous, right? I mean, as somebody who's now lived in this country for 15 years, but who came here for graduate school and you know, has the luck being associated with various kind of elite institutions and so on. I just barely know anybody who didn't go to college. And I barely know anybody who didn't go to an elite college. And I barely know anybody who doesn't have a graduate degree. And I think we should be very self-reflective about the dangers that tempts us into and how we think about this country. I'm struck by the fact that, perhaps not in a strict logical sense, but in a sociological sense, one of the preconditions for being a small d Democrat is to think that most of your fellow citizens are decent people who are capable of responding to decent moral reasons most of the time. Doesn't mean they can't be terribly wrong who they vote for a particular time, they can't be terribly wrong for many years in tolerating some injustice in that country. But it must mean that you have to have some kind of trust that your fellow citizens are actually capable of persuasion, they're capable of being appealed to on moral grounds. And I think most of my friends in this country don't have that today. And that's something that really worries me about the state of our country.
Steve.
Yeah. Thank you for the talk and the analysis. I guess for me, when I try to evaluate sort of a normative vision of what our democracy should be and how do we get there, it has to, at this point, answer how does it get us out of various crises that we're in the moment. And it's very easy to think of the crisis as having to do with identity, equality. I actually think there are multiple ones, but one of the big ones I think is actually best put by Bruce Kane. We spent like 7 years or 8 years here at CDRL working on polarization. And his line is, yeah, we have a crisis of polarization. We have a much more fundamental crisis in this country of representation. We have a system now where majority preferences on all kinds of issues cannot possibly be turned into policy outcome. And you cannot have a democracy where, several folks on the Supreme Court decide that actually the 70% who think that Roe v. Wade should stand, no, it's not going to stand. And you go through a whole litany of issue areas. But this goes to your majority minority. Because I think you have your finger on something that's really important. I think a lot of the backlash is in that, but that was a choice the Republican Party made. Right? Karl Rove, the great documents where they're looking out to the future. The Republican Party is looking out to the future. And they're going, we're toast. Shit, we're toast. It's going to be a majority minority country. We're going to be toast. And here's a hat here, but we don't need to give this up. We can make claims that can be very appealing to Latinos. We can make claims to, we don't have to take this. It doesn't have to be our fate. And what did they do? They doubled down on it and said, no, actually that is our fate, and that's how we're going to play it. And actually, it's been incredibly successful, right? The backlash politics. So, what is it? I'm obviously feeling very pessimistic, Yascha, but what is it in the book that's going to make me feel like we do all this, we're going to get to the point where we no longer have the crisis of representation. Things actually get done, and the will of the majority is at least occasionally translated into policy.
Yeah, let me say a couple of things. The first is that this book is in good part a book about the United States, but it's not primarily an exclusive book about the United States. It's a book about all the different diverse democracies in the world who are facing the great experiment at this point, which include, at the very least, the Western European democracies in Australia. And at least in certain respects, countries like India and Brazil, which have slightly different histories and are deeply fit, but I hope to speak to them as well. And so the first point I just want to say is, look, even if we solve a particular problem of representation in the United States, we still need to have clear guidance as to how to make our society work. Because, our professional acquaintance or colleague from journalism, Lee Drutman, said, this book should have added for proportional representation, that will solve it. Look, we can debate the merits of proportional representation, but I was just in Germany and the Netherlands talking about this book for German and Dutch editions, and somehow nobody there said to me, oh, this book is irrelevant here, we already have a system of proportional representation, right? So even if we manage to solve the problem that you're talking about, there's still a fundamental set of issues that we need orientation on. And that's what I try to provide in the book. So that's one foot. Look, yes, the Republican Party has taken the disgraceful choice of trying to deal with their fears about the supposedly inevitable democratic majority through voter suppression and other kinds of tactics. But I think you're letting the rest of the political spectrum off a little bit too easily, because that certainly is also the explicit political strategy of many Democrats. And what your presentation of that situation doesn't explain is how Republicans are making huge gains among non-white voter groups, right? If all of the strategy was...
I read all the Latino stuff, very specific, very specific areas.
No, it's not.
The blacks, African Americans, it is very slight. It is very slight, right? That's important.
Look, we'll see how it goes in 2024 and 2028. But I really think that we have... But frankly, on this, it sounds like a lot of people have their heads in the sand. When you look at 2020, it's not. So it's not. For example, Cuban voters in Florida, particularly, the biggest swing was in the southernmost districts of Texas, which are 50–60%. Well,
but not Arizona.
Right, so there's some places where it's stronger and there's some places where it's less strong. Right now, when you look at Latino approval ratings for Biden, it's gone down very, very, very far compared to what was a few years ago. I really think that if we put our head in the sand about this, we will keep losing. And so it's very important.
But no, we're talking about, I think your critique of the Democratic strategy is the correct one. I think, but notice, I mean, for me, I don't think they're fanning the flames of this. I think they're just desperately hoping it's true. They're desperately hoping that a majority-minority country will help them. And that's all they know, because they don't know how to get to white, no longer middle class that have gone to the other side. They just don't know how to do it.
Well, they should try a little bit harder. So I think, look, it's incumbent on Republican politicians to try and build a generally cross-racial coalition. They've done surprisingly good at it without trying very hard. I hope they'll start to actually try. But I do think that Democrats also have to try and win back some of the countries that voted resoundingly for Barack Obama in 2008 and that voted in the majority for Barack Obama in 2012. And what I'm still hearing from Democrat strategists I talk to is that those states are gone, we'll never get them back, no point trying. And I think that is a significant strategic and moral mistake, because what we should all remember is that the vision, let's say we're both wrong, right? We seem to actually agree on the strategy to some extent. Let's say we're both wrong. Let's see if the Democrats manage to build this political coalition by focusing on this rising Democratic electorate. The vision of that country is really worrying and threatening, right? Because if we have elections in the 2040s, let's say, in which Democratic Party always somehow scoots through and wins, but you have, a huge wide voting bloc that nearly uniformly votes for the other political party and that feels displaced and angry, and by the way, has a lot of guns. That is the recipe for diverse democracy that's going to fall apart. So I recognize that this
actually we're very close to that. I mean, Louisiana passed, felony murder law in terms of somebody now driving somebody to get an abortion. If they drive them to the airport, they can be charged with felony murder. That's where we are as a country if this goes forward. If the Roe v. Wade is overturned.
So I'm sorry.
Tell me all of the niceties about how we're going to get them on our side. Right? It just, I don't know. There's something about this moment that isn't captured, in.
We can continue.
Yes, we can.
But so in the final 2 minutes, we could have Larry and Yascha. Do you want to ask your questions succinctly if possible, and maybe give Yascha 1 minute to respond?
My question kind of builds on what Steve was saying. Maybe I'll phrase it in a slightly different way. If your ultimate concern is not just about social peace, but democracy, the analogy would be to health. If you've got heart disease and it's cured, but you die of cancer, you're just as dead. And what worries me is that, yes, I think Europe has made really interesting progress. I think it's stunning the degree to which Europe is gradually becoming multiracial societies. And I think what we've learned from Europe in maybe recent years is what we know from the United States, that if you can just have a moderate pace of immigration, if it's not too sudden and too overwhelming, democratic societies can adapt to it and absorb it and become more pluralistic. But that leaves us with a couple other problems beyond the problem that our institutions were deficient to begin with and are now increasingly broken in the United States. One is that we have this ideological polarization, and I think what's going to erupt now over abortion is the most dramatic current manifestation of it. And there is a political tribalism that even if it doesn't take a racial, religious, or ethnic identity form, can be devastating for democracy and is clearly being driven by social media and by rising inequality. But I'm not sure we fully understand all the dimensions of political tribalism. By the way, the purest laboratory for this is Korea, which is one of the most ethnically homogeneous countries in the world. And right now, one of the most politically polarized democracies in the world on left-right dimensions. I mean, talk to our colleague upstairs there, Gi Wook Shin. These political camps despise each other. And Korean democracy has really been deteriorating as a result. And I'll just say one other thing. I think whatever else you say about, or might be tempted to conclude about how we're becoming more complex in the political mapping of race and ethnicity onto partisan loyalties in the United States, and the, in a way, comfort you can take for the fact that Hispanics and Asians in the United States are becoming more politically diverse in their loyalties. We are left with several dimensions of the ethnic identity problem in the United States, but one that is core and deeply rooted in our original sin. And that is anti-Black discrimination, just pure, raw, slightly reconfigured racism, just a straight line trajectory from slavery to the current moment in the American South. It is shocking. It is increasingly, like I said, thinly covered up. And that, it seems to me, just doesn't fit with I realize your book is global. There's a lot of diverse trends, but what's happening there just doesn't resonate with me about what I see happening in American society now, particularly in that element.
Okay, so there are two more questions. We're just gonna have to wait. I'm sorry, we are out of time, like very over, but I do want to give Yascha a last chance to respond.
Yeah. So apologize, I'd love to answer any questions afterwards or over lunch or whatever. So let me say a few things on this. I think it is absolutely true, and I emphasize in great detail in the book, that we have, but one of the things with any diverse democracy deals with is the legacy of its past. But one of the historical modes of failure of diverse democracies is what I call various forms of domination, and in the American case, hard domination. The extreme form of subjugation and exclusion that many groups have suffered, but particularly African Americans have suffered in slavery. And that obviously continues to structure our societies in very deep ways today. And that this is often politically exploited at the moment. It has always been exploited politically, but especially at this moment, is also evident as morally outrageous. Even on that, I think it is important to see that there has been some progress. So Donald Trump said in 2016, facing Black voters, vote for me, you're out of a job, your schools are terrible, your neighborhoods are falling apart, what the hell do you have to lose? And that was offensive then, and it's offensive now, because it is simply a wrong description of the state of Black America, right? So what you have, when you look, I think, at the situation of African Americans today, is a substantial minority of African Americans who live in deeply disadvantaged neighborhoods where the legacy of that hard domination is evident in the most extreme way. But you also have not just sort of a small Black upper middle class that existed a few decades ago as well, but actually really a relatively broad Black middle class. So one of the points I emphasize in the book is that when you look at the median African American today, they live in a reasonably affluent suburb. They have a white collar job. They have employer provided health insurance. They've gone to college for a number of years, they're below the age of 40. And actually, interestingly, African Americans are more optimistic about America and more optimistic about the American dream than white Americans. Now, none of this is to excuse any of the things you're talking about, which are obviously real, but I do think it puts that into context and allows us to be a little bit optimistic, even about the progress that we've made on that count. Now, more broadly, look, how does my description of how ethnically and religiously diverse democracies can work help us deal with those political crises? To some extent, it can. To some extent, it's different topics. I've written a book and many other writings about that other topic squarely, and this is about a slightly different topic, and I think that's fine. But I do also think that the two questions are linked in one very important respect. And I was thinking about that in the context of French elections, but I think it's also very important in the context of the American elections coming up in 2022, and especially 2024. When you look at the French political discourse during this election, you had a deep pessimism from Le Pen and from Zemmour saying nothing's working, everything's falling apart, and those people are there today. And then you had a lot of the left in the media sort of responding with, well, it's true that nothing's working, it's true that everything's falling apart, it's sort of out. And, you know, thankfully, Le Pen did not get elected, but that is dangerous because that makes it very tempting to say, well, if everything is going to shit anyway, let's blame them rather than us, right? And so I think we need, even if it's hard when you look at Congress, when you look at what's going on in our politics, we need a vision of society that most people would actually pretend to live in. We need to be able to provide a guidance for, if we hold it together in this mode, if you don't put people like Trump in charge, we can actually build a society in which all of us are going to have a good place, in which all of us are going to be able to lead decent lives. And if we don't have that vision, if we don't defend that vision, that makes it way easier for the people you're talking about to gain power with all the terrible consequences of that.
All right. Thank you, Yascha.
Thank you, everyone.